Hi, welcome to this episode of Knitting with QueerJoe. Glad to have you here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about separating knitting and politics. For 18 years, having written a blog called QueerJoe, I've been purposefully combining politics and knitting. In fact, I describe my blog as a knitting blog and an LGBTQ issues blog. So it's a combination of both. But in recent years, the overlap of politics and knitting has caused some issues. So I wanted to do a little bit of a more in-depth discussion about that. And I will give you a little bit of warning before you continue on with this, that I am going to talk about some of the issues that have caused an enormous amount of controversy in the online knitting world. And so if you're not at all interested in delving into any of that stuff, feel free to look down in comments and just use the fast forward timestamp link to go to current knitting. And you'll just avoid that entire topic. So grab your project. If you have a project you're working on, feel free to grab that and let this run in the background, and hopefully you'll listen in. I'm currently working on my current project, which we'll talk a little bit later about in current knitting. And let's go. So separating knitting and politics, is that even possible? One of my favorite conversations in virtual online knitting communities is, why can't we just stick to knitting? So let me talk a little bit about the history of politics and knitting. So from the earliest days, even of this country, way back to the 1700s, there has been an overlap between politics and fiber arts. One good example of that is when we were still the colonies and under British rule, there were women who competed about trying to make as much yarn, spin as much yarn as they possibly could to avoid having to pay the taxes to the UK. And so in large part, our entire country was based on some level of using fiber arts as a political statement when it came to that kind of stuff. Fast forward significantly and talk about the knit list. The knit list, for those of you who weren't around for that, was an old listserv, one of those things where you could post an email to what they call a listserv, and it would distribute it out to anybody who would subscribe to that particular group. And so the knit list was a very large group of knitters who used to either get individual emails every time somebody would post to the knit list, or they'd get a daily digest of all the emails that had been posted that day. And even in the rules for that list were mentions of something very political, which was the war on Christmas, that you couldn't discuss war on Christmas, that those kind of conversations would be stopped by moderators. It was the annual political argument that basically said, if you say happy holidays, you're infringing on my right to practice my religion. And if you say Merry Christmas, you're foisting your religious views on me, and as an atheist or a non-Christian type of thing. It was happened every year, and it always blew up into one of these, you're not respecting my right to practice my religion, and you're not respecting my right to not practice any religion at all type of thing. That also morphed into many boundaries about religion and non-religion too, because, and again, I don't think you can separate politics and religion either. So this became an important aspect of how people started to test the boundaries every time you put rules in associated with online forum type of rules and etiquette. So the basic rule was you can't discuss religion and politics. And they're pretty straightforward, but they couldn't really stop people from doing that. So for instance, a lot of people would have signature files. And if the signature file, the thing that ended every one of their emails that they sent out ever. So if I had an email signature file, for instance, that said, have a blessed day, Is that religious? Maybe. It kind of presupposes some sort of higher power, I guess, or some sort of ability to be blessed. But does that infringe on my rights to not believe in any kind of God, for instance? Probably not. It's kind of a mild case of people kind of saying, is this acceptable? And so then what about if somebody says, have you accepted Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, as their signature file, as an example? That's clearly religious, and clearly not, it only applies to Christians and even a specific group of Christians that believe in Savior, being saved by Christ. So is that acceptable? And so people would test those limits, and they would constantly keep pushing and pushing at the boundaries to see what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. And then that was one whole thing, and it happened all the time, and it was impossible to really carve out just exactly what was religion and what wasn't religion in such a way that you could say, yes, that definitely is, and no, that definitely can't be. So then a little bit later on, as we started to progress in our social media, there was a big dust up on Instagram where a woman was talking about her fears of traveling to India. And I don't know if any of you were participating in that. I wasn't. I'm not a big Instagram person, but I seem to have heard a lot about this. The woman used less than artful language to describe her fears of traveling to India, and compared things like traveling to Mars and other alien type things, and her fears about doing that kind of thing. And somebody called her out on it and basically told her she was racist in her language. And so there was this huge dust up about whether or not that really was just inartful language, or whether it was purposeful racism, or even tacit racism that just showed up in her language and was just an indicator that she had racist ideas. So that blew up for a while, and it didn't garner that much attention, but there was enough. And then, of course, there was the huge blow up when it came to, I think this was also on Instagram, with Nathan the Sockmatician, who again minimally used inartful language to describe his ideas of knitting diversity, and was called out on some of that language. And in my experience, I don't think he handled the response very well, but it also blew up very fast, and there was a huge blow up. If you want to read more about this whole thing, certainly feel free to do some look on Sockmatician and racism or something like that, and you'll see very strong opinions on both sides of this. But it basically boiled down to, was his language racist? And worse, was his response to it denial of racism? And in my mind, the entire thing could have really been handled with a very sincere apology and a promise to look at ways that he had spoken in a way that might have misrepresented his true intentions. But the fact that he constantly denied it, it actually got to the place where it was like, it seemed like it was almost purposeful. And there are a bunch of other factors involved in this whole thing. And shockingly, it was primarily the people who were defending him were not the people that should really define what racism is, because they weren't themselves people of color, for instance, and things like that. Again, I'm not really qualified to talk about this as a cisgendered white gay man myself. I have certain blind spots about this kind of thing, and I think all of us have some level of racism in terms of how we think, and even if it's unknown to me, I'm certain that I do have those kind of blind spots. And the difference, I think, honestly, is I'm very open to feedback on that. I've made mistakes in the past when it comes to sexism and xenophobia and racism and sissy shaming and all these other things that have kind of changed. In fact, as I've started to been called out on various things that are clear when I write them in my blog or in online forums, I kind of feel like, Joe Biden. I kind of feel like I'm a dinosaur when it comes to understanding the rules, because the rules honestly are changing and they're constantly evolving, and there's certain things that seemed acceptable, even though they probably never were, but they seemed acceptable because they were so prevalent as I was growing up and growing older. But I do have to say I am absolutely open to feedback on anytime people have perceived me to, like at one point I said something that was very sexist in my blog, and not even thinking about it, I was called out on it. And I was really grateful to have heard that feedback. I always think that I need to at least look at those things, even if I don't agree with the person who's saying it, or especially if I don't agree with how they say it. I still need to take a look at it and say, is this true? Is this something I need to work on? Is this something I need to apologize for? Is something I need to do something about to fix? And those are the kinds of things that I think we're missing in the response in the case of Nathan and that whole dust up. And of course, one of the more recent ones, I'm sure there have been others as well, is the whole Ravelry decision to exclude any support of our country's current president. And gotta hate using that word even. The question that first came up when Ravelry first said, we will not allow any comments in forums or patterns or any kind of support of Trump allowed on the Ravelry website, the entire website. I thought to myself, is it really, is equating Trump support with hate a valid comparison? Can you actually say that that's true? And initially, I didn't like the decision Ravelry made particularly. I shouldn't say that. I liked the decision because it went along with my personal political views. But did I think the decision was right? And I really didn't at the beginning. I thought it was too far overreaching. But I've since changed my mind about it. There was one perfect example of why I thought you could never, without putting in such a strong dictate about what you can and can't do with regard to supporting somebody that they consider to be hateful and bigoted himself, unless you completely obliterate everything from the website about that, then there's going to always be the possibility that people are going to try to push that line. So here's the example that I saw. I saw this woman who was very angry with Ravelry's decision, but I didn't know her position on Ravelry when I first started reading this. So she basically started posting a lot on various social media things that she had published a pattern for a flag, a crochet pattern for a flag, and it had been deleted by Ravelry. So a US flag. And she was incensed, how unpatriotic. I mean, you can't even publish a flag. What kind of fascism is that? And so there was all this outrage. And of course, from the people like me who didn't understand her point of view, didn't know her point of view about Ravelry and that kind of thing, I thought, God, that seems really strict and really strident of a thing for Ravelry to do. Why would they do that? It's a flag pattern, for God's sakes. Is that supporting Trump? And of course, you got all this outrage from the far right white people about this that were already incensed with Ravelry's decision to not let them hate in the name of Trump. And so when I dug a little bit deeper, I realized what she had done is she had called the pattern FLAGA, F-L-A-G-A, and made it clear that the inference was that the flag was a MAGA flag. And so by combining flag and MAGA, she came up with FLAGA. And that's what Ravelry said, no, we won't accept that. And so they deleted it. And so that's the exact kind of thing where people are constantly going to try to test that line. And so I asked, is there really a possibility of separating politics and knitting? I don't think there is. I don't think it's possible that you can actually separate those two things. When it comes to larger groups of knitters, you're always going to get those people who will be those I consider to be fanatic assholes who insist on testing the limits to see just exactly how they can protest what they consider to be injustice. You know, and I want to make it clear, I don't want to talk, I don't want to equate these same people with the people that protest actual injustice. So when there's injustice and hate and discrimination, and people protest against that with things like pink pussy hats, for instance, another overlap of politics and knitting, I think that's a really valid way of expressing political dissent and protest. But when you're advocating for hate and division through your testing of the limits and my religious freedom and that kind of thing under the guise of what looks right but is really just another form of hate, that's when I find that I am so in line with places like Ravelry when they make decisions about that. I've since absolutely been behind exactly what Ravelry did, and I think it was the exact right thing to do, and the only way that it could really create a safe space from hate in an environment with as many people, with as many different points of view as the people on Ravelry. Finally, let me be very clear about where I stand. I don't believe anybody will be surprised about my position on this if you've been reading my blog all along, so I don't think this will be any kind of surprise for y'all. But as a cisgendered white queer man, I am against racism, homophobia, sexism, classicism, xenophobia, transphobia. I also clearly recognize that there's much I don't know. I've talked a lot in the past about the massive amount of ignorance I have about an amazing array of different things, but this is included in that. And I have made my share of ignorant mistakes in the past as well. Finally, I am absolutely receptive to any and all feedback where I can be a better person when it comes to my blind spots. I may disagree with your feedback, but I will always try and objectively assess whether it's valid or not for me, and whether I can validly own that kind of feedback and say, yes, I was wrong here. And for that, you can always count on me to apologize when I am clearly wrong. And but I'll also tell you if I think you're incorrect in your assessment of that or why. And that doesn't mean to say that I will be defensive about the feedback. I will just hopefully try and reestablish what the initial intent of any mistakes that I might have made. So that's where I come down on trying to separate politics and knitting. In all truth, I don't think you can. I think politics and knitting are inseparable and completely knit together in a way that you can't separate them possibly. I'd be interested to hear what you have to think about that kind of stuff. I'd be more than interested to hear whether if you were involved in the Instagram woman's description of her fears of traveling to India, or if you were involved in the whole Nathan Taylor controversy, or any of the older knit list things and your views on those things, especially if they provide additional insight into how we can create safe environments in a way for large groups of people to be able to discuss these things in a way where people don't get crazy about it. Again, I don't know if that's possible either, but let's hope that it is. So with that, let's go on to current knitting. So one of the things that I've been working on these days is a new project by Crafty Lucas. If you remember, last week I had posted that I had started a free shawl download by him called the Ever Trusty Shawl. I put that aside because he, in one of our Zoom knit together meetings, he had asked if anybody would be a test knitter for a new cowl that he had designed. And so it's called the Danao cowl, D-A-N-A-O cowl. It's not yet up on Ravelry because it's still in test knit, but it's basically a 2-layer cowl that's done with stranded knitting. And I'm doing it in these 2 colors of red and white, which is, one is Kathmandu is one of the yarns. It's DK weight yarn from the Queensland Connection. And it's 85% merino wool, 10% silk, and 5% cashmere. That's the green yarn. And the red yarn is actually John Q designer Heather DK. And I'll put this in comments. It's also a DK weight yarn in Foxy Red is the color, shade 126. And this is actually, sorry, looking for it's 100% pure new wool. So I'm working on that and I'm trying to finish that up so I can provide him feedback as far as his test pattern goes. And you'll see more of that later this week. Thanks again for joining me this episode of Knitting with QueerJoe. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it useful that this was a video format because I wanted to be as personal as I possibly could when it comes to addressing these kind of things, and hopefully make my intentions about who I am and what I feel and what I believe as clear as possible in a way that y'all could understand it. With that, I think I'll sign off and wish you good luck and wonderful knitting over the course of the next few weeks until I see you again in the next episode of Knitting with QueerJoe. And thanks. Please leave any comments or questions either at the YouTube video, on my blog, or message me directly if you are afraid it might cause a bit too much controversy or you're afraid you might be judged by what you have to say. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thanks.